All right, thanks for sticking around. Never cross Gene Hackman. That's what I've learned. Never. So would you please welcome the screenwriter of Mississippi Burning, Chris Gerolmo, and our moderator for the day, Will Conroy.
Thank you. Oh, there's already water. Yes, we're all ready.
Hello.
Hello, this is a real thrill for me. And I wanted to start just by saying, you know, you hear sometimes a lot when I'm going through my Twitter feed these days or on the channel surfing in the news at night, you hear a lot of times people say that we should have a national conversation about something, usually race. And it's always a little poignant to me because it just feels like that conversation is not coming. And we call for it all the time and it's not coming. But December of 1988 was a different time. And as most of you will recall, we saw movies together in theaters and they could make a big impact in terms of millions of conversations around the country and around the world. This movie did that in spades. And it was also controversial. If you have a movie set in the civil rights era with two white FBI agent heroes, that's going to be controversial, and it was. I think that Chris, over the years, and we only met for the first time last spring, but I will say that I think he has answered questions about the controversy with incredible thoughtfulness and grace for decades. And it's what's moving to me is when you go back and sort of get to the beginning, which is what I first wanted to ask you about. The very beginning of how you got the idea to write the screenplay and where it came from.
I was working in my father's office in New York City in, 1985, I think. And I read a one-page article in, of all places, the New York Post, excerpting one chapter of a then new book called Inside Hoover's FBI by two agents who had long careers in the FBI and worked on, I think, a dozen different cases. And they wrote one chapter about each case. And the one-page article I read excerpted the chapter about this case in which it became clear that the FBI had, when they ran into the intense unwillingness of people to speak because of the fear of Klan intimidation, that got back to Lyndon Johnson, who called J. Edgar Hoover in on the carpet and said, if you don't solve this case, I'm not going to allow the rule of law to be subverted in my administration. If you don't solve this case, I'm going to send in the 82nd Airborne. And J. Edgar Hoover said, we can solve the case. We just have to have different rules because the Klan intimidation is more effective than FBI intimidation. And Lyndon Johnson said, do whatever you need to do. And so the gloves were off and people were taken for rides and people got beat up and people were held incommunicado for 3 days. And it was basically, as I understand it, I'm not a journalist, but as I understand it, this was basically the last time in the kind of modern history of journalism when the New York Times stringer could be there and see you do something illegal as a cop and not say anything about it or write anything about it, because they were kind of on the Fed's side in that particular case. So that made me, I was an aspiring screenwriter at the time, and just I just went, oh my God, what an idea for a movie. If we could organize a story about how these guys got to this point where they were ready to do that, to take the gloves off, to go to extra legal methods to solve it. And that's where I made up the one thing that I really did make up. He took some heat in the press for inventing some parts of the story. The thing I really made up was the story of Francis McDormand. That's made up. The guy who told them where the bodies were buried was never identified, not identified when I was writing. He has since been identified, but he probably told the FBI where the bodies were buried in return for $30,000. And I just thought this was a better story. So I just made up that the wife of the sheriff's deputy character and this relationship, which I thought would be fantastic.
I think it is fantastic, and especially with Gene Hackman and what actors playing those roles, Frances McDormand. Just as an aside, as Bill Schmidt alluded to before the screening, my stepfather, John Doerr, was actually the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department by the time the trial occurred, which wasn't until 3 years later, October of 1967, is when these men were finally brought to trial on civil rights charges, which is also something that was very unusual at the time, to use a federal law to prosecute a murder, and that was John who sort of decided to go in that direction. And but it's interesting because I saw most of it when I grew up. John had a farm in upstate New York, and there were pictures of the arrests, and there was documentation all over the house, and I used to ask him a lot about it. But the FBI did a good enough job and documented it well enough so that it stood up in court, which was extremely difficult. The jury was still, even though it was federal charges, all whites in Mississippi. John said that one of the reasons they were able to prevail, which was like climbing Mount Everest, was an early decision by Judge Harold Cox, who was very much like the movie's judge, not a friend to the prosecution. But they had decided that you could get jurors from all over Mississippi, not just Neshoba County. If it had been just Neshoba County, no way any of those guys would ever have been convicted of anything. So, but one of the things I love about your story, before we get to the controversy, and I'm going to open it up for questions, but it's a detective story. It feels to me at its heart. And when I read a little bit, I've read some of your old interviews and some of the origins of it, it seemed like that's what interested you the most, and that's what you were doing, the Klan versus the FBI. Is that right? That it was a little bit more intimate, not so epic in scope when you first wrote that first draft?
Well, that's certainly what attracted me to it, was that it was a detective story in which, in a way, of course, the good guys win. Now, it's not exactly a resounding victory, but it's a victory. And so it's a detective story in which the good guys win that was set against a huge sea change in American history. And that's what made me feel like that could be a great movie, because that combination of a driving story that keeps you going and that you want these guys to get where they're trying to go, that's also about a profoundly important time in our development as a nation, that can add up to something great. I just thought it could be a great movie. And it took me some years to persuade anybody to, in fact, let's put it this way, I never did persuade anybody to pay me to write it. That's what I wanted to do in the beginning. When I first saw the article, I said, gosh, we got to go to Hollywood and pitch this. And we went to Hollywood and pitched it, and no one was interested. So I ended up writing it 3 years later anyway. And that's how we got it going. So
the proof is in the pudding when you write that script. Which, if I can just take a minute, on the internet, such as it is, one of the great things is if you go into these sort of obscure cinephile sites, it turns out you can see one of Chris's early drafts before Alan Parker, the director, became involved. And it's pretty great, because for two reasons. One is that every important great beat is in that first draft. As a minor screenwriter who's done some independent stuff, I can say that it's a little devastating to see the way once the script gets into production, it's just shredded from 1,000 directions, and you do rewrite after rewrite for different interested parties, actors, producers, distributors, and it can just become something completely different. This did not. Although with one crucial caveat to that I'll mention in a minute. But the early draft, which was so good and wonderful, seemed a little more intimate to me in terms of being more focused on this one story. Not, I think what Alan Parker, and I don't know, but what it seemed to me is that what Alan Parker brought to the table was a little bit, make it a little more self-consciously epic in a Hollywood style about this, like the movie about the civil rights movement, which is interesting because that's what brought on a lot of the criticism. But just to say, there was a couple of scenes in that first draft. There was a dinner party scene about 20 minutes into the film, right after they discovered the car, where everybody first sat down to dinner, which I thought was incredible. That's where Anderson, the Gene Hackman character, first met the Frances McDormand character. There was also a scene in which a local black teenager expressed reservations about the FBI, which I think was an important point, and that was a good scene.
That could have saved us some trouble, yeah.
And there was a bunch of scenes that could. There was also, and I'm talking too much, I got to ask you about this, but one of the big controversies was there was not a single black FBI agent in the FBI. This was J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, who aggressively investigated Martin Luther King Jr., not a friend of the civil rights movement. Lyndon Johnson, who has been in other movies about the era, to my eye, stomped on, was actually a great president in this area and forced Hoover to basically take the gloves off and get everything done. But I guess I'd like to know about that. Like that, in your first movie, there was no black FBI agent. There was a mafia guy from sort of Florida who owed the FBI favor and stuck a gun in his mouth and said a line which I really loved. In order to get him to talk, he said, "There is no shame in loving life." And then he took the gun out and the guy said everything.
Who wrote that?
So
here's the thing.
So I was wondering about that.
A friend. Well, first of all, there's what Alan brought to the table, and both good and bad, and then there's where that story came from, and what it meant to the life of the movie, which is sadly much too much. It really does mean too much in the life of the movie. But that scene was based on a true story that was told to me by a friend of mine who did his own research, who's a novelist and a policeman named Frank Hickey, and he found out that in the course of this investigation, the FBI picked the guy they thought they could make confess to what he knew, and flew up a mafiosi from Florida who owed them a favor from a previous case one night to hold a gun in this guy's mouth and threaten to blow his head off and mean it. And then apparently either he said or I made up that line, which was fantastic. I have to write that down for me. I got to use it again. And now that, as I understand it, was true, and I believe it has since been verified as being true. Alan is a very kind of in-your-face director. And there's a lot of this movie that reflects that, and it profits from that fact about Alan. But he's also, as Pauline Kael once said about him, Pauline Kael being one of our great film critics, said about him once, he uses a blowtorch where a candle might do. And he wanted this incredibly kind of powerful image of a black man threatening to emasculate a white man, because it was so confrontational, and in his mind it would be so exactly what white racists would be afraid of, that's what they deserve to have to see, and that's what should be in the movie. And I kind of, gosh, it really, really didn't help the reception of the movie one way or the other, because people fixed on that as like being kind of Hollywood bullshit, and in a way it was. I mean, on the other level, on the level of other things that he brought to the table, good and bad, as you've said in the screenplays that I wrote before Alan got involved, the world of the town was a little more complicated. It wasn't just, angry white people and black victims. It wasn't exactly that simple. Alan is kind of a little bit of a Hollywood Marxist. You know, he had 6 cars, but he was a believer in, you know, the working people, and he made it a little more like black people were suffering and everybody's poverty is why they were angry. Okay.
A screenwriter once got upset with Billy Wilder, the great director, and who was making changes to his script, and he ran up and he said, "Well, Billy, what about the subtlety?" And Billy Wilder gave it back to him and he said, "The subtlety's fine, just make it obvious." And I think that's what you run into here, and I think Chris is being typically generous. I think that, you know, this, like I say, this movie made a huge impact, but Alan Parker, so when you also read your original script, you sort of see some of the things that Alan brought in, and most of them it felt like almost all of the kind of more, the platitudes, sort of larger civil rights context, right from the first shot, which was the black and white water fountains. That kind of announces this film is about segregation and the civil rights movement. The staged interviews with the locals, the sort of news interviews, weren't in the original script. That final scene, the singing in the burned out church, and your final scene was, the investigation was over, and well, it's all your final scene, but I'm saying that first draft was all the federal vehicles, all these black cars going back up onto the highway. Probably an aerial shot of like, we've finished, see you guys later. And I felt like that there was some understated stuff to your script, which I thought gave it a lot of power. I'm a fan of understatement, but that seemed to change, and that caused a lot of the controversy. And I'm wondering, when I say this film made an impact, cover of Time magazine, a whole Nightline show devoted, and I remember watching that show with the entire, basically, crew of Eyes on the Prize, the civil rights PBS documentary that I was a production assistant for at the time. It was huge, and everybody on Eyes on the Prize, whatever their criticisms, felt like this was an incredible force for good, this movie. This was incredible. Nobody had heard of this case. Now it's called the Mississippi Burning case. But it was incredible how few people knew about it. So they felt like they owed the filmmakers a great debt. But I'm wondering, for you, Coretta Scott King famously wrote an opinion about it without having seen the film, but she knew what was going on. She was reading the criticism. She wrote an article, I think for the LA Times. It was picked up everywhere. Mm-hmm. I kind of, I'm wondering what it was like those days and months for you. It was unbelievable. You went from being an Oscar favorite across the board to sort of, oh, well, the knowing class was now going to turn their back.
Yeah, that's true. There was a time, I guess at that time, you have to understand that when the movie was on the cover of Time magazine, that meant something, you know what I mean? Like, there was one movie, maybe 2 a year that was on the cover of Time, and it was a big deal, and yet the headline was, this movie, a searing new movie raises questions of fact versus fiction, clearly implying that we had distorted the story. And it just had a negative enough tone that I remember going to dinner at a Thai restaurant with a couple that were friends of mine, and when I got there, the husband was wearing a brown paper bag on his head with eyes cut out. It said on his forehead, "Nothing to do with the Mississippi burning." And his wife was wearing a bag on her head that said, "Me neither." And that was really just captured the way we felt about the movie at that time, because we were being kind of excoriated and we didn't really understand it. And in retrospect, of course, I understand what was at issue and the politics of identity, and I think that in a way we were at the beginning of an important national conversation about that. That's been going on for the last 32 years and started before it and will go on for a long time, about who gets to tell whose story and in what form. And I understand that. I'm glad that we're part of it. At the time, it was, it seemed a little unfair. you know, I discovered this story that I found, and I wrote the screenplay, and I had gotten an agent by then, and we offered it to Orion for one day for a then princely sum, and they said, we'll take it, we'll make it. Fantastic. So that's how we got there. Then when the movie was made, and particularly as you point out, when Alan kind of dressed it in the clothing of, you know, Hollywood's first movie about the civil rights movement, well, then it was perceived, particularly by Coretta Scott King, as Hollywood having made the wrong movie. That they should have made a movie about Martin Luther King or the black people who were the heroes of the civil rights movement, and not a movie about white people fighting with other white people in which the black people were just victims and extras. And well, on that level, I understand completely. But what came out of the articles was the accusation that we had distorted history. Well, yeah, but it sounded to people like we had distorted the story that's of this movie, which we hadn't really. I mean, I had made up a female character, but other than that, and the black guy wasn't black, he was white, and he held a gun instead of a razor blade. But other than that, we kind of stuck to the story as it really happened. But we didn't tell the right story by their lights. But, you know, that article that she wrote, which was published as an op-ed in the LA Times, was reprinted in 1,350 newspapers across the country. And that was it. We went from being 2-to-1 favorites for Best Picture Oscar to no longer on the board. Oh, well. Here's the thing. I wish I had gotten nominated for an Academy Award. I really do. Would have meant some dough, particularly. Because they pay you a lot more for your next few jobs. But this is something that happened as a result of this. And this goes back to what Will was talking about the national dialogue that it would be nice if we could have had, or if we could still have, about race. Because there's a documentary called Long Night's Journey into Day about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where they did have that dialogue. After the racist regime fell, the new government decided to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it invited people who had committed crimes under the old regime and offered them immunity if they would talk about them in public and why they committed them and what happened. And one of the guys in that movie, Long Night's Journey into Day, was a secret policeman in South Africa and had killed 4 different black leaders. And he came forward to testify to the commission about what he had done and why. And people in the movie asked him why he had had the courage to do so. And he mentioned an American movie about apartheid, Mississippi Burning. Well, shit. You know, I'd love to have an Academy Award sitting on my mantle in Brentwood, but we got to influence, at least in this much, you know, the political life of another nation. You know what I mean? How many times do you get to do that with a movie? You know, and when the A-team comes out to help you make your movie, man, it's really solid. You know, like these actors are...
Actors like that are a screenwriter's best friend.
Oh.
But in terms of the truth of the movie, it's a fictional movie. It's a poem. It's not prose. And I think Richard Schickel in Time, I read, said the truth of its testimony is not so much literal as gospel. And I kind of like that. I feel like that's what most of the Eyes on the Prize staff producers, who many of whom were there in Freedom Summer, that's what they felt. For whatever criticisms. And I also think in terms of that identity politics, it's just very interesting to me. A lot of times when people criticize a movie, it's just exactly what Chris said. It feels to me in today's culture, it's not so much the movie they have trouble with, it's the movies that aren't being made. They blame the one that was the particular filmmakers who made that particular film for the lack of the films they wanted to see. This film, Mississippi Burning, I think gave way, yielded to some incredible films. Just the next year, Do the Right Thing hit the screens, Spike Lee's film. Glory, Ed Zwick's film, and then many more. And that's what happens. There are different experiences. Selma, which was Ava DuVernay's film, I thought of it when we were watching this. She got a lot of criticism for her treatment of Lyndon Baines Johnson and his attitude toward which was sort of very directly communicated. I mean, he just turned around, where he was an enemy of the civil rights movement and an enemy of Dr. King, which doesn't seem fair when you look at the whole record. But she was asked about that by Henry Louis Gates in an interview, and she said, "Everyone sees history through their own lens, and I don't begrudge anyone from wanting to see what they want to see. This is what I see, and that should be valid." I think it's easy to get mad at that, but I've come around in my life now, in my mid-50s, to think, yes, the answer to speech is more speech. These are fictional films, stories, and they come together sort of to form this large thrust of our culture, and I think it's a great thing. That's my personal opinion. But I guess it would be great if anybody had some questions for Chris, that would be terrific. Back in the back there.
Yeah. Did you have any reservations about writing a story that belonged to someone else? Did that stop you, or how did you move forward with that?
No, it didn't. I didn't. Here's the thing. My mom was a dedicated civil rights activist. She marched with Martin Luther King twice, I guess, from Selma to Montgomery and in the March on Washington. And she would come home. I remember when my father said goodbye to her when she went off for the march from Selma to Montgomery. I was 12 years old, and he met her. He let her go at the door with a box of Band-Aids and a peanut butter jar full of martinis, and said, "Don't get hurt." And that's where I came from. So I was looking at this story through the lens of a white kid whose white mother had made this effort, being part of the civil rights movement, seem heroic. And the idea of sort of creating two composite FBI characters, one of whom had been a local sheriff, and one of the real characters had been a local Mississippi sheriff, and had complicated attitudes about race, and another who was kind of stood for the new kind of Kennedy administration, all these people are ignorant kind of attitude, looked fantastic to me. Let's make a movie about that. So I did it.
And what I love about your mother being on that 1965 march is that my stepfather, John Doerr, was there in his role at the Justice Department, and also Henry Hampton, the executive producer of Eyes on the Prize, was there. So
Fantastic.
It's amazing how many. Love being
I
on the
haven't
stage
told
with
you how
Chris.
much I admired Eyes on the Prize, by the way.
Great, I was getting people their coffee. Thank you. I think it was really terrific. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering how you would compare the racism of the 1960s to what's going on today with police departments and with Trump supporters.
Yeah, the question is sort of how this relates to today.
I think it's the movie still plays, you know what I mean?
There are people on both sides.
There are people, this is a very tender area in America. I remember when Bruce Springsteen made a record called Born in the USA in 1985, and I went to a lot of those shows in that tour, and he would often talk at that time to the audience about the shame and the glory of being an American. The shame and the glory of being an American. And that really made an impression on me. That was 1985, and I wrote this like a couple years later. And I really was in my mind consciously writing about the shame and the glory of being an American, and how hard it is sometimes to hold in your head that we're this too. You know what I mean? We're what we are at our best, and we're what we are at our worst.
So
And it's still true.
have we improved, or are we regressing?
I think it's fair to say that, and that the culture has moved forward in some ways, but there's also a huge undertow backwards? And one of the facts about real life in the 21st century is this, that some of us are living in the 21st century, and some of us, and you only have to drive, 50 miles from here to get to people who are kind of living in the, the 50s of the last century. And you don't have to go but 5,000 or 7,000 miles that way to go to be visiting people who are living in the 15th century. You know what I mean? There's a lot of world out there, and cultures are coming along at only the rates that they're coming along. It's not where we want it to be. And we have a lot of growing up to do. So that's just as close to an answer as I could give you.
Anyone else? Yes.
When I was watching the political rally in the movie that he was calling a Klan rally, it seemed to me that it could have been a MAGA rally. That's kind of one thing that hit me, but I wanted to ask you, you said there was some criticism about the scene where he put the gun, well, the way you wrote it, he was cutting off his balls, but I mean, what was the criticism? Because how do you make somebody, that it was just Hollywood shtick? I don't see that as Hollywood shtick. How do you make them talk other than be serious about what the hell you're going to do?
Oh yeah, that nobody criticized that.
I thought you said there was.
What's the question?
The question is about the castration threat scene and why people would have objected to that.
Yeah, nobody threatened to the violence of it or the reality of the occasional necessity for persuading people to say what they know. No, that's not what they talked about. They were saying that I believe this is true, that there were only 2 black people in the employ of the FBI at that time, and they were both J. Edgar Hoover's domestic servants who were illegally on the FBI's payroll. There were no black FBI men or women at that time, and people. I can imagine if I were black, I can imagine being offended by a portrayal like that in a movie where I happen to know that wasn't.
Right. Also, I think, if I can add, from a civil rights perspective, from some of the people that were there, there's the larger. This is a Hollywood story about the FBI taking their gloves off, and I'm sure a lot of that did happen. But I think that for the people that were there, especially the Freedom Summer kids, and the idea that it was the FBI's sort of extracurricular violence that solved the problem. Not so much. It was the kids. It was the news coverage. I mean, this is a journalism series. It was those pictures going back, and moving pictures on the news of water hoses, and the other thing about Philadelphia, Mississippi. I guess Alan Parker had a penchant for casting the most extreme-looking, kind of stereotypical redneck. And some people, there was some count, I think Pat Buchanan got upset about that, some pushback on that. But I will say that my experience reading about and seeing a lot of footage and learning a lot about Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, it was a brutal place. It was a horrible place. Fred Zollo, one of the producer, once was asked about it, said it's just the deepest, deepest, darkest place. Martin Luther King Jr. went there twice. He went there a month after the murders to give support to the locals, and at that time he had a lot of FBI protection, and he gave a very moving speech to the people that were there. He then went back 2 years later, which nobody had been, I guess they'd been arrested. The trial hadn't happened yet. And he had turned against Vietnam, and all of a sudden all this federal protection ended. So Martin Luther King was there on the courthouse steps talking to people, and the deputy who was behind him, who had killed, there was a famous exchange where he said something to Martin Luther King, who turned around and said, yes, you're the deputy who arrested the 3 boys. And he said, yeah, I am. And Martin Luther King turned around to the crowd and said, I feel like the people that did this crime are right around us. And the deputy said to him, you're damn right they are. And he had no protection. So, and he later said, this is Martin Luther King Jr., said, this is a terrible town, the worst I've seen, which is an incredible thing for him to say, I think. There is a complete reign of terror. And John Doerr said in an interview, he called it a bootlegging rural outpost. He said, a rough, mean, insular place. It was awful. And knowing John the way I did, that's about as extreme as he would get. He was very measured. And so I can't even imagine. I think it was pretty brutal. Yes, over here.
What's your next project and why?
Next project. What's your next project and why?
Thank you for asking that question, Nancy.
Oh, it's a plant. It's a plant.
We're about to go out and pitch a 6-part television series about Jeffrey Epstein. But not exactly about Jeffrey Epstein, more about a couple of his victims, a couple of the cops who spent some parts of their careers trying to get after him, a couple of other people who got in trouble for trying to go after him. And so it's really more about, it's kind of a series about the people who tried and in the end, you know, didn't quite succeed, although almost, you know, who tried to stop what he was doing. So,
That's what.
Oh, and why? Why did you pick that potential?
I don't know. I have two twin 16-year-old daughters. Everything I read about Jeffrey Epstein and his behavior offended me very deeply and very personally. And at the same time, the machinery of justice that made his life so easy instead of as hard as it should have been for what he did really deeply offends me, really offends me. So that's why I'm pitching it.
I feel like the way Chris Gerolmo picks his projects is really from the heart and very admirable and doesn't always happen in Hollywood. Yes, sir. One or two more.
Do you have any comments on the fact that I was shocked almost at the end of the movie that it was filmed in Mississippi and Alabama? I was kind of going, not Louisiana, I was kind of going, wow. Things may have changed a little bit.
About where it was filmed, why it was filmed in Mississippi and Alabama. I think, didn't you want it, Alan Parker wanted to film all in Mississippi.
I think they tried to film it as much as they could in Mississippi. They found a much better looking little town square. That town square when you see Clayton Townley drive up in the Cadillac, you know what I mean? That town square looked really good, and that was in Lafayette, Alabama, right across the border, and so they went there. Can I tell a negative story about Alan Parker?
I love it, but apparently we're going to lose the theater very soon. So.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No, make it negative and fast.
Okay, well, Gene Hackman finally had enough of Alan's bullshit on the first day they shot in Lafayette, Alabama, right? And Gene's a big guy, he's a Marine, and Alan made all these sotto voce comments about him all the time, and finally Gene needed somebody to walk across in the distance to look like it was Clayton Townley arriving in the Cadillac, and he finally had to ask somebody to do it himself when they were shooting. It's called your eye line in the movies. And Alan said, if you stop trying to direct the movie and just acted in it, you might be good. And Gene got pissed off and picked him up and jammed him against the side of a car. And an electrician had to come and save him. And fantastic, I wish I had done that, but there you go.
People don't realize the electricians are crucial.
Are huge, too.
Okay, we're going to end it. I wanted to say, Chris, thank you. I'm so glad you wrote it. I'm so glad it was made. And I'm so glad you came and answered all our questions here in Tucson. Thank you very much for coming.